Good day, everybody. I hope that you're well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 1 English lesson on sentence parts. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English language arts. We're doing grade 1. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to our chapter of sentence parts. All right. So our chapter is sentence. We're doing sentence parts. Our subject is English language arts. We're doing grade 1. And then the lessons that we are going to be focusing on under the chapter of sentence parts is the sentence is the naming part or is it an action part? So is it the naming part or the action part of the sentence? Right? So within a sentence, right, there are different parts. We have a naming part, which tells us about, it basically names a person or thing that is doing the action. And then we also have the action part, which tells us the action or the thing that the naming part does, that the person or thing does. Right? And we're going to look at the naming parts as well as the action parts of a sentence. All right. So we said that the naming part, it tells us either who or tells us what the sentence is about, meaning it tells us about the person or thing that the sentence is about. That is the naming part. And if we look at sentences, right, if you look at these three sentences, it says the dog eats a bone. So the dog eats a bone. And if we were to identify the naming part within that sentence that basically tells us who or what is doing something, then we would say the dog or dog eats the bone, right? So the dog is the naming part within that sentence. If you look at the next sentence, it says the airplane is big. So the airplane is big. We need to identify the sentence, that basically the naming part. We need to say who or what the sentence is about. The airplane is big. Who or what is the sentence about? Or let's say, what is the sentence about within that sentence? And if we were to identify the naming part within that sentence, and we would say that airplane or just airplane, that is the naming part within that sentence. And then the next one says, Jim is happy. Jim is happy. Remember the naming part, it tells us either who is doing something or what is doing something within the sentence, right? So it's either the name of a person, or it is the thing, or it's an animal that is doing the action, right? So if we look at the last one, it says Jim is happy. We need to identify the naming part within that sentence. Who or what is doing the action? So who or what is doing the action within that sentence? It says Jim is happy. Yes, but that is the whole sentence. So if we identify, so now it says Jim is happy, but now we need to say who is doing the action within that sentence. Who is the person or thing that's doing the action within that sentence? Yes, well done. And if we were to identify the naming part that either tells us who is doing something or what is doing something, meaning who is happy, then we will say Jim is our naming part. Well done. Remember the naming part, it's either the name of a person or it's a thing or it is an animal that basically tells us, who or what is doing something. Well done. So now we're going on to our action part. It's almost like the verb, the action part. The action part tells us the action that the person, thing, or animal does, right? So now it tells us the action that the animal or the person or the thing does. And it says the action part, it tells us something about the naming part. So it tells us what the naming part is doing. And we said the action part can tell what the naming part does, and it can also tell us what the naming part is like. So it either can tell us what the naming part does, or it can tell us what the naming part is like, right? And we're going to look at a few examples. These three examples, one of the examples will either tell us what the naming part does, or it will tell us what the naming part is like. Remember, the naming part can either be a person, it can be a thing, it can be an animal, right? That does the action. But now we are focused more on the action that the naming part does. And if we were to identify the naming part within that sentence, the sentence is the dog eats a bone. So the dog eats a bone. We need to identify the naming part within that sentence. And if we were to identify the action within that sentence that tells us what the naming part either does or what the naming part is like, then we say the dog eats a bone, then eats. It tells us the action, or basically, it tells us what the dog does. The action. The next one says the airplane is big. So the airplane is big. We need to identify the action part within that sentence. The airplane is big. It either tells us the action, or it tells us what the naming part is like. Either what the naming part does or what the naming part is like. The airplane is big. And if we were to identify the naming part, or let's say the action action within that sentence. And it says the airplane is big. So is, that is basically telling us what the airplane is like. And the next one says Jim is happy. Jim is happy. We need to identify either what the naming part does, what Jim does, or what Jim is like. So Jim is happy. And if we were to identify the action or something that either tells us what Jim does or what Jim is like, then we just say Jim is our, that tell us what he's like. Because happy is an adjective. All right. So when it comes to sentence parts, right, then we have a naming part and we have an action part, right? And we see the naming part, yes, well done, is correct. We have a naming part and we have an action part. The naming part, it tells us either who or it tells us what the sentence is about, right? The naming part can either be a person or thing, or it can be an animal, right? That it basically the sentence is about that person or that thing, right? And that person or that thing does an action. And then we have an action part, right? And the action part within a sentence tell us something about the naming part. It tells us about the animal, it tells us about the person, it tells us about the thing. And it either tells us what that animal, person, or thing does, or it can tell us what the person, animal, or thing is like. Tells us what the naming part is like or what the naming part does. All right, so now we're going to a+students.ca. We're going to do quickly a little activity and then we're going to our test. It says we're going to our lesson is we're going to say is the naming or an action part of a sentence. We're going to say if it's a naming part or an action part of a sentence. All right. And we said every sentence has a naming part and every sentence has an action part. And we said the naming part within a sentence, it tells us either who or tells us what the sentence is about. And then we have the action part of the sentence that tells us something about the naming part. It either tells us that the naming what the naming part does, or it can tell us what the naming part is like. All right. So now we're going to do an activity where we're going to say is it either a naming part or it's an action part of a sentence, and then we're going to our test. All right. Now it says, look at the part of the sentence in. We need to say, is it a naming part? Or we need to say, is it an action part of the sentence? So we need to look at the words in bold. The words in bold, is that a naming part? Or is it an action part of a sentence? So draw pictures. It says Ned and Janet draw pictures. Ned and Janet draw pictures. We need to say, is it a naming part or an action part? So the words drawing pictures or draw pictures, is that a naming part or is it an action part? So draw pictures. Ned and Janet draw pictures. If we look at the words in bold, if we look at this words in bold, is it a naming part or is it an action part? Ned and Janet draw pictures. And if we were to identify if it is either a naming part, the words in bold, if it's either naming part or an action part, it says Ned and Janet draw pictures, then we can say that this is an action part. And how do we know it is an action part? Because if we look at that first one, draw is the action that Ned and Janet does. Draw pictures. And that is an action part. All right. It says, look at the part of the sentence in bold. This in bold. We need to say, is the words in bold, is it a naming part or is it an action part? So the words in bold, is it a naming part or an action part? It says, the children carry their books. So carry their books is in bold. Is that a naming part or an action part within that sentence? So the children carry the books. And if we were to identify if it's either a naming part or an action part, then we can say carry the books is an action part. It tells us what the children are doing. So what are they doing? They carry their books. All right, and the last one, and then we're going on to our test. It says we need to look at the part of the sentence in bold. And then we need to say if the word in bold or the part of the sentence in bold is either a naming part or an action part. Our teacher took that picture. So our teacher, we need to say if our teacher within that sentence is either a naming part or if it's an action part. Our teacher took that picture. So our teacher. And if we were to identify if it's either a naming part or if it's an action part, then we can say our teacher is a naming part. It tells us either who or it tells us what the sentence is about. It tells us who took the picture. And if we were to identify it, then yes, we said it is a naming part. It tells us who is doing something or what is doing something, and that is our teacher. All right, so now we're going on to our tests, where we're going to say, is it a naming part or is it an action part? All right, it says we need to look at the part of the sentence in bold and we need to say if it's either a naming part or if it's an action part within the sentence. Bees make honey. So, bees, the word bees. So bees, the word bees, is that a naming part option one, or if is it an action part option two? So the word bees, and if we can say bees and we say it is a naming part. Remember, it is a naming part. It tells us who or it tells us what is doing the honey or making the honey. So bees, which is a naming part. Well done for trying. The next one says we need to look at the parts of the sentences and the word in bold. So our dog, it's in bold. Do we say that it is a naming part or we say it is an action part within the sentence? All right. And if we look at the sentences, our dog barks at squirrels. And if we were to identify the word in bold, then the word in bold would be a naming part. It names our dogs. The next one says, look, these shoes make funny noises. These shoes make funny noises. So now make funny noises. We need to say it is a naming part, option one, or if it is an action part, option two. So make funny noises. And if we were to identify if it's either a naming naming part or an action part? So make funny noises. And if we were to identify either if it's a naming part or a predicate part, and then we can say it is an action part. All right, so it is an action part. All right, so make funny noises in action part. Well done. So Robin found a penny. So Robin found a penny. So found a penny. We need to say if that is a naming part or an action part. All right. And the last one says Robin found a penny. Yes, well done. Robin found a penny. So found a penny, the word that is in bold, found a penny. Is it a naming part or it's an action part? Found a penny. Sorry, I haven't been watching the comments. And if we were to identify if it's either a naming part or an action part, then we can say it is an action part. Found a penny. Remember, it's an action because now it's telling us what they did, right? So they found the penny. An action that took place. They found a penny, right? All right. So we said that within a sentence, right, we have naming parts and we have action parts. The naming part, it tells us either who or what is doing the action within, that time. And the action part, it tells us what the action that either the person, thing, or animal does. So this is the end of our lesson on naming on sentence parts. Thank you very much for joining, and I really hope you're going to have a good evening further. So till next time, goodbye. All right. Good boy.